Hello everyone, and welcome to this tutorial brought to you by Codelabs Academy. Today we will see how we can manage the state of a ReactJS application using Redux Toolkit. My name is Mo, and I am a web developer and a web development instructor here at Codelabs Academy. And here are the talking points for today's tutorial. So we'll start by talking about why you should even use Redux Toolkit, and then we jump and use Redux Toolkit in our application. While doing that, we will understand all about reducers and actions. We will understand creating a Redux store and why we should do that. We will see how we can use the useSelector hook, when you see here, to call any specific piece of data from that store, and also how we can dispatch Redux actions to manipulate that specific piece of data. And last but not least, we will talk about async Redux with thunks, so we can do asynchronous operations and manipulate our state while doing that. So this is the layout of the application we're going to work on today. So we have a simple app.js main component, and we're including all the other subcomponents inside of it. So we have sidebar, a navbar, an edit component, and we have other subcomponents like the menu link and the welcome subcomponent you see here. So here's the application we're trying to create here. So this is a simple storefront, and as you can see, we have a navbar here. We have a sidebar with some menu links. These are the menu link subcomponents, and the part you see here is the edit component. So the edit component include a welcome component. This can be used for notifications, for example. And we have also a simple form to update the store name and the email. And these are the piece of data we want to work with and manipulate. The common thing between all these components, as you can see, is the store name. So we have store name here, we have store name in the navbar, and we have store name in one of the menu links inside of the sidebar. So if we want to see how this is happening behind the scene, we're basically creating a functional state in our app.js using the useState hook, and we're passing our data or our state to other components. Like, for example, we can pass the name as a prop to the navbar components, and we can do that for the other components too, just like this. So we're passing all the data we need from app.js. So this is what we call lifting up the state. We're lifting up the state of our application. So far, it's a simple state. We just have a name and a method to update this name. And then we're doing prop drillings. So we're passing the prop to all the first components of app.js, and then we're passing the same props to the other subcomponents. There's a simple exception here. We're passing the setName method to edit component 2 because we want to do something like this. I want to be able to update the name here and see it reflected in all the other places we're using the same piece of data. So if I change this like this, you can see that the name gets updated in all the places we're using it. So this is possible by creating the functional state. So in the app.js, which is the main component, we're creating a simple functional state using the useState hook. You can see it here. So useState hook is basically a simple hook provided by ReactJS. We will create our piece of data using the useState hook, which is the normal way to do that in ReactJS. And then we're passing the same piece of data to all the other components as props, like the navbar here, sidebar, and the edit component. Okay, so far so good. We have a piece of data. We're able to update that piece of data, and we can see the update reflected in all the components using that piece of data. Here's the problem here. I added a simple console.log statement in all of the components using this name value. I did that to check whether the component will get re-rendered if we update the value we have here. And indeed, as you can see, if I delete the E here, you will see navbar rendered, sidebar rendered, and the edit component is getting re-rendered too. And not only that, if I add a console log to the welcome message here, to the welcome component, we will see welcome rendered too. So this might be a big problem for us. This is a simple application so far, but if we have a huge application and we're using the same approach, then whenever you update that piece of data, all the other components will get re-rendered again. Now the edit component is not really using this piece of data. Instead, the welcome component or subcomponent is using it. So it doesn't really make sense to re-render the edit component, and the edit component is not even using that piece of data. Now let's see our application's layout again. We're passing the same piece of data to all the other components. Even though sidebar doesn't use this prop, we need to pass the prop to sidebar in order for us to pass it to the menu link subcomponent. And it goes the same for the welcome subcomponent. We're using the name prop inside the welcome subcomponent, so we need to pass it to the edit component, even though edit component doesn't even use it. So what if we have an application that looks something like this? Imagine all the red background components, they use the same piece of data, which is name in our case right now. In order for us to pass the same piece of data to this component, into this one, so basically all the red components, we need to pass it to the parent components too. So all the other components are going to use the same piece of data, or are going to receive that same piece of data, and also get re-rendered if that piece of data changes. And this will create a big problem for us. This will make our application really, really slow, because all the other components need to get re-rendered, even though they are not using that piece of data. That piece of data is not reflected in that component at all. So that's really not an ideal approach for us. And that's probably the best situation, or the best indication for you to go and use a global state management like Redux Toolkit. So if we use Redux Toolkit, for example, the same layout will look something like this. So the global state that we are going to create is this one with red background. So as you can see, it's really not connected to all the other components. We will see how the connection actually occurs in the code. But yeah, it's a global state. It's kind of an independent component. And the only responsibility that this component will have is defining a piece of data and passing that piece of data to other components. So for example, if the menu link component needs the name that we have, the piece of data here in the global state, all we need to do is to call that piece of data from the menu link subcomponent, and the global state will provide that piece of data to this subcomponent. And it goes the same for all the other components. Basically, you just need to call that piece of data and you will get it without passing that piece of data to all the parent components. So we don't need to really pass this to the sidebar, to the navbar, to the edit in order for us to use it in welcome and menu link. We just need to call it from whatever component we're working, and the global state will just give it to you. We just give the piece of data to you, which is really, really awesome, right? So instead of passing all the components like this, we're passing the same piece of data to sidebar, and we're not really using it in sidebar. We're using it in the menu link. So if we change this piece of data or update it, the sidebar will get re-rendered again. And that goes the same for all the other components using the same piece of data. Okay, so now that we know the drawbacks of lifting up the state to the app.js component and passing the prop to all the other components and subcomponents, let's see how we can use Redux Toolkit to create this piece of global state. And then we will go from there and use that piece of data and even manipulate that piece of data. And last but not least, we will see how we can do asynchronous operations and manipulate our global state at the same time. So let me go back to Chrome. This is a simple quick start doc from the Redux Toolkit documentation. So as you can see, the user summary here, the first step would be to install Redux Toolkit and React Redux. We can do that using either npm or using yarn. So we can either go to our terminal and paste the same code, hit enter. I've already installed Redux Toolkit and React Redux, so I don't need to do that again. You can also use yarn, add Redux, React Redux, okay, React Redux, and what is the other thing? ReactJS Toolkit. Hit enter, and you will install both dependencies using yarn. Now, after installing both dependencies, we need to create a Redux store. So the way to create a Redux store is to just create a simple store.js file inside your app or any folder inside the source folder. We will need to import the configure store method from Redux.js Toolkit, and we basically assign whatever value this method gives us to the store variable here. And we need to export it too. So let's do the same here. Let's go to our application. I'm going to create a new folder here. Let's call this one Redux. Let's create a new file here, store.js. And we have our store created already. Awesome. Now you can think of the store as a simple object which will contain the whole state of our application. So basically, this store will contain any slice of state you will create in your Redux using Redux Toolkit, and you will manage it in your ReactJS application. So let's go and see what is the next step here. Now we need to provide the Redux store to React. So somehow we need to tell React, hey, there is a store we have created which will contain, which will be just a simple object containing all the state of our application. We need to provide it to you in order for you to use it. And the way to do that is simply by importing a simple provider component from React Redux, as you can see here. And then you need to include the app.js inside of that component. So basically, I just need to copy this code, go back to VS Code. I'll open up index.js. This is where I have the app component. So if I do this and I delete the app component again, and now I just need to import the provider and import the store I'm using here. As you can see, I'm just using the auto-completion to grab the store from whatever place I'm holding it. So it's from Redux folder /store.js, Redux folder store.js, and we have them both imported here. Okay, so this is the second step. We created a store, we provided the store to our main app.js component. Let's see the third step now. Now the following step would be to create a Redux state slice. So think of your store as an object which will contain many slices of state. So if you have a state that belongs to the user you want to maintain, that state is going to belong to the user slice. And if you have a counter, for example, like this, you will create a slice and you give it a name of counter. And basically all your slices are going to be different pieces of data you need to manage in your React application, and they are all going to be stored inside your store that we have just created. So as you can see here, creating a slice requires a string name to identify the slice, an initial state value, and one or more reducer functions to define how the state can be updated. So first, how can we create a slice? The Redux Toolkit provides to us this counter slice method, and we will use this counter slice method to create our own slice. So again, we need to provide a name string to identify the slice. We need to provide an initial state. This one is defined here as an object and used here as a parameter. And then there's another parameter we need to pass, which is reducers. Basically, reducers will contain many parameters like this. So we have increment, decrement, and basically any function you want to create to manipulate that piece of data. So in this example, the initial state is a simple object containing one key value pair value, and the value of this key is 0. We have some functions here to manipulate that piece of data. So we're going to manipulate that value using the increment function. So this increment function, we will pass to it the state, the current state that we have. This is the initial state, this is the current state now. And then we just manipulate that piece of value. So you just like accessing that state object, accessing the value property from that state object, and you increment it by 1. Same thing goes for the decrement function, and there is an increment by amount. So basically you want to increment that counter value by an amount. We pass that amount as an action payload, as you can see here. That's why we have state.value. So we're accessing that property, and we're just adding to it whatever payload we add here as a number. So if it's 2, we add to it 2, if it's 3, if it's 4, etc. Now the last thing is we need to export all the action creators that we have inside reducers, and all these are going to be contained inside the counter slice actions property here. So basically this counter slice method, whatever this returns to us will be stored inside the counter slice variable. One of the things createSlice method returns to us is the actions property here. So we are grabbing all the actions from this property here. So we're grabbing the increment, this one we created here, decrement, and the increment by amount. And the last thing is we need to export the whole slice as a reducer. And we will come to this next. We will see why we need to export this next. Okay, so basically this is the simple slice. This is the way how you can create a simple slice. So I can just grab this code. I go back to my code, VS Code, and I will create inside the Redux folder a new file called, this is a simple store interface. So it will be a good idea to call this account slice, for example. So let's paste the same code here, and then we can modify it to be the slice we need. So first you need to import createSlice method from Redux.js toolkit, and then we're creating here our initial state. We can either create it as a simple object here and then call it inside the createSlice method as param, or we can do this inside the createSlice. It doesn't matter really. So we're creating this for the account slice. We need to change this to account slice. Let's get rid of everything we have inside the param we're passing as an object here for the createSlice, and let's do this all over again. So we need to pass a name parameter to identify the slice. The name is going to be account, simply. The second thing is the initial state we need. So we're passing this object here. We don't have a value here. Instead, we should be having, let's see, this should be name. Then we have a simple name here, store name, for example, and also an email value that we want to manipulate and track. So let's go with email@example.com. That's it. And the next thing we need to pass is the reducers param here. This is going to be an object containing all our action creators. So you can think of reducers as basically just some bunch of functions to manipulate that piece of data you have here. So let's start with one simple action to update the name we're storing here. To do that, we can start by the name of this function or this action we want to create. Let's do, the value is going to be an arrow function here. We need to pass the state, the current state, as an argument. And then basically we just call that piece of value we need to update. And the second thing we need to pass here is the action payload. So the action param here, it contains the payload. Now this is predefined. Let me give you an example here. The idea of this action that we need to dispatch in order for us to update the name is basically after you create a function, you need to call it like this. So update, and you just pass a new name. Let's go with the new name. And this value you're passing here is going to be the action payload. So if we need to grab this value, whatever value we're passing as an argument to the update action, we grab this value from the action payload. So it's going to be, the same value is going to be the payload. And the payload is another property of this action object. So that's it. This action here, when you call it with any value, that piece of value is going to be our new name. Cool. Now, the other thing we need to do here is to export the valid actions we have. And we only have one action, which is update, and it's going to be stored inside counter_slice.actions. Not really counter slice, it's a count slice now. And last thing we need to export is the whole slice of state as a reducer. So export default account slice.reducer. Now comes the next part. Why we're really exporting this slice as a reducer? It makes sense. It makes sense to export the update, so we can use it from all the other components to update this piece of data. But why really we need to export this as a reducer? That's why do we really need to export the whole slice as a reducer by default? Let's go back to the documentation so we can see that next. Now, each slice is going to be considered as a reducer for the store. So that's why the next step would be to import the reducer function from the slice you created and add it to the store. So if we go back to our store here, you can see this reducer property here. And the value is a simple object. If we only have one reducer, we can just add it here. And if we have many reducers, there are going to be more properties inside of this object. So we only have one account reducer. In this example, you give it a name, a property, and you assign whatever reducer you created as a slice as a value for this name. So the reducer we're going to use is account here, and we're going to pass to it the account slice. So this is getting imported from the account slice that we created here, and this is going to be a default export. So the value we're assigning to the account prop here is the account slice reducer. So the reducer function that's going to be generated from the createSlice method is going to be the reducer, which the store is going to use. So the store now is aware of this slice of state, the account state, which contains only the name and email values. Okay, so now we have configured our store. We created a slice of state, which is the account slice in this example. Everything is set up for Redux Toolkit to be used. So what is the next step? Let's go back to our application here. I don't want to use functional state anymore. So I'm going to delete any reference to this functional state. Let's start by doing that. We don't need the useState hook. We are not going to pass any prop again. We are going to use Redux Toolkit. So let me delete all of this code here. Awesome. Now, before we go back to the browser, let's make sure we are not using that prop again. Otherwise, we're going to get some errors. So we're not using the name and set name anymore. Okay, maybe, yeah, we don't need to use this functional state here again. Let's keep this here so we can see whether the edit component is getting re-rendered or not. This is a simple function for handling the update of that form here. We're not using this anymore. Let's get rid of that. And let's get rid of this too. No value is going to be passed here as well. Okay, cool. We don't need the useState hook anymore. What about the menu link? We're not passing name anymore, so we don't need it here. And we don't need it here too. Awesome. Okay, what about navbar? We're passing name here. We don't need to pass it anymore. And let's not use this here anymore too. What about sidebar? Yeah, we need to pass it again. So this is prop drilling. You always need to pass props to parent components, and from the parent component sidebar to the child component here, which is the menu link. Okay, and what about the welcome page here? We don't need name as prop, and we're not passing it anymore. Awesome. We don't need that here anymore. Let's see. Okay, now let's take a look back again at the browser and see what's happening here. So as you can see, we don't have that name anymore. Don't have it in the welcome components, in the navbar, or in the menu link for our sidebar. So how can we call that piece of data now from our store? Let's go back here. Let's say we want to call this first and use it in the navbar, okay? So let me open up the navbar. So to call that piece of data that we need, which is the store name, in this case, we need to use the useSelector hook. So this useSelector hook is provided by React Redux. And basically, this is the hook you use to grab any piece of data from your store or from that state slice. So how can we grab the store name? First, this useSelector hook is going to accept a callback function as an argument. And this callback function needs a parameter. The parameter is going to be the current state that we have. So this is just a simple arrow function here. And we just need to access that value from that slice we created. So the slice is going to be inside the state, and that piece of data, which is name, is going to be inside account. So this is going to return to us our username we created, specifically the initial state that we have created or defined. So this is going to be returning to us store name. Okay, so let's assign this to a variable too. Store name equals useSelector state as an argument, and we're accessing the name from the account from the state. Cool. So next thing would be to render this variable store name. Now if we go back and take a look at the browser, yes, you can see the store name here. Now to make sure that this is coming from our slice state, let's go back to the slice and let's change the initial piece of data here. Let's change this to CLA, save the file, go back to the browser, and yeah, you can see after a refresh, we can see CLA here. So basically I want to do the same thing for all the other components using the same piece of data. We want to do this in the welcome component, and we want to do this here for the menu link too. Then next, we will see how we can dispatch an action to update that piece of data from this form. Cool? Okay, let's go back to code and do the same for the sidebar. We're not going to use that piece of data in sidebar. Instead, we're going to use it in menu link, right? So we don't need to call that piece of data in sidebar at all. We just need to access that menu link component. And basically here we're going to call that piece of data. We're going to call, store name. And we're going to check whether we have the store name defined or not. If we have the store name, then please add it here. If we don't have that store name, so maybe the user is not logged in yet, just show exit. I'm going to call the store name first. So store name equals, again, useSelector. We pass the state as an argument, and we grab the name from our account slice from the state. Cool. And here, we're just going to pass store name. Let's go back here, refresh the page, and we can see exit CLA now. Let's do the same thing for the welcome component here. So here's our welcome component. We need to use the useSelector first. So the callback, again, we need to pass current state as an argument, and we access the name from the account slice from the state. And then we just print out our store name here. So store name, and that's it. Let's go back to the browser. And yes, as you can see here, we're doing the same thing we did when we first started. So we're printing out the piece of data that we need, which is the store name, the shared piece of data of this application. And we're getting this piece of data from global state now, and not from the main app component. We're not using any functional state. So here's the other thing I want to show you guys before we continue next to dispatching actions. There's a cool development extension that you can find for Chrome, for example. There's one for Redux, so you can check in real time how the Redux store is looking like. As you can see here, we can check the state, the current state that we have now. And as you can see, we have one slice, which is the account. And inside of it, we have name and email values. We're using the name, not using the email value yet. So let's do that for the form we have here. Let's go back to VS Code. The form is inside the edit component. So again, here we need to grab two things. We need to use the useSelector again, and we're grabbing the name here first. So state.count.name. And we're going to assign the first one into a variable called store name. And the second one is going to be store email. Cool. So we grab the email instead of name here. And let's use this as values for the input and for both inputs. Or let's use this for as a placeholder. So as a placeholder for the store name, let's use store name. The same thing for email here. Let's go back. And as you can see, we're using both values from the state, global state, as placeholder. Awesome. Okay, so the next thing we want to do here is to dispatch an action to update either the name or both the name and email. If we want to update both name and email, we need to update our update function or action from the account slice. So let's do this next. Let's go back to account slice. So for our update action, the only way we can call this is by its name. And we pass a value for the name, like a new name here. Okay, this is the way we are creating this action. Now I want to update this action so we can update both the name and the email using the same action. So let's now consider this. The first is the name, and then the let's pass an object instead of a simple value, and the object is going to contain both the name and the email, like this. So the payload dot name is going to be assigned for the name, and the email is going to be the email property from the payload. Because again, the payload is this whole object. The property name, we get it from here, and property email, we get it from here. Awesome. Now the only thing we need to do is to go back to the edit component here, and we're going to use the handle update, which is going to be executed when you click the update button, this button here. So far, when you click this, the only thing we will get is action dispatch from console. Take a look. We click this, you see action dispatch, but instead of just console logging this here, we want to update the name using the update action. So to use any action, to actually call any action from your store, you need to use the useDispatch hook. So we select data from that store using the useSelector hook, okay, and we dispatch actions using the useDispatch hook. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use this hook, right? So instead of using useDispatch, I'm going to store whatever value we get from there inside dispatch variable. This is a new variable we're going to create, and just call dispatch instead of useDispatch. So I'm going to call dispatch. Now the property we need to pass here, as you can see, is the action we need to pass. We have one action which is update, right? And since update is getting exported here from the actions of the slice, we can grab it. We can import it too. So we can import it here too. As you can see, we're importing update from the account slice that we have, and we're just calling this, or just passing this as an argument for dispatch. Now this is a function, right? And we need to pass an object here. And the object is going to contain two properties. First is the name, the new name we want, and the second is the new email, right? So we're going to start with this, guys. Now, how can we do this using ReactJS? Simply, we can do something like this. We can create two functional state using the useState. We can track whatever user is typing inside that functional state. And once the user is done typing the new name and email, he's going to click on the update button. And once the user clicks on that button, we're going to grab whatever updated value or the latest value we have from that functional state and use it as values for our update action. So let's do this. We're going to have name. We're going to have name and set name as functional state. Let's keep this empty for now. And we're going to have another one for email too. So email and set email. Let's keep this up. Let's keep this empty here too. Now, the next thing we need to do is to update that functional state whenever the user changes the input. To do that, we just use the onChange event listener. And when this changes, I want to grab the event, and I want to use the set name. So the event object contains the value we need from the input, right? And we're going to pass a value for the set name method to update this empty name we have here to that new value. So it's e.event.value. So if you don't know much about React already, the useState hook will return two things to us. First is an initial state, functional state, which is name. And basically the value of name is going to be whatever value we pass here. And the second thing useState returns to us is the method to update that piece of value. So setName will update, calling setName method will update the name, and calling setEmail method will update the email. So we're going to do the same thing for both name and email. Let's do the same for email, change this to email. And that's it for us now. Okay, cool. So when we click this button, here's what I want to do. We're going to dispatch an action. Now the action is going to be the update action we created inside the account slice. And the action payload is going to be this object here. So basically, whatever name we have, latest name we have here, and latest email we have here. Awesome. So let's try this quickly now. Let's see this in action. Let's go back to the browser. Okay, the useState is not defined because we need to import it too. So let me import useState. And one other thing we need to change here is that value is accessible from the target, not events. So event.target.value, like this. Awesome. Okay, so before we do any recap, let's go see this live. Let's see this in action in our browser now. So we have the same name from our global state, CLA here, and CLA here. So if we change this to a new name, and we change the email to email@gmail.com this time, before I do anything, I want to open up the Redux Toolkit development extension. So we can see any action we are dispatching, and we can also see the state that we have. So let's see. For the first initial state, we have CLA as a name, and we have example email.example.com as an email. I'm going to update this. And as you can see, the first thing to notice is that the new name is used in all the other components. Cool. Now, the second thing here is that we are seeing another action being dispatched here. And now for this action, okay, we're going to have a new updated state. And now the new updated state is for the account slice, name to be new name, and email to be this new email. We can see the difference in this tab. You can see that email was changed and CLA was changed to new name. And you can see basically the payload of the action you passed to inside actions. So let's have a quick recap on what's happening behind the scene here. So the first thing we're doing is updating the input. So whenever the user types anything inside the input, this onChange event listener is going to execute this function here. So this callback function will update the functional state name into whatever value we have for the input. So that's why we're using the setName method here. And setName comes from the useState. So useState returns two things. First is a current state, whatever state you pass here, whatever value is going to be stored for this name value. This is the first thing this returns. And the second thing is a simple method to update that current state. So these are functional states, and these are Redux Toolkit state. So we're getting this from the global state here, store name and store email. And we're using the functional state here just to keep track of whatever user is typing inside the input. So don't confuse that with the global state. The global state is used here. We're grabbing the global state using the useSelector hook. We're storing them both in store name and store email. And we're using both store name and store email as placeholders. So that's why if we refresh the page, you'll see CLA as placeholder and email example.com as placeholder too. The second thing is we're using the useDispatch hook inside the handle update function. Now, handle update function will get executed whenever you click on this button here. You see we have an on-click event listener, and when you click on this button, we will execute handle update. Now, when you execute handle update, the first thing we're doing is to prevent the default behavior, which is refreshing the page. And the second thing is dispatching the update function or the update action. Now, this update action was created inside the account slice, and this accepts a simple payload object. Now, let's go back to account slice. You see, this is the update. This is where we're defining the action. We're passing two things as parameters. The first is the state, the current state is the second thing, and the second thing is action. Now, whatever we're passing in, whatever we're passing as an object here is going to be our action payload. So we access the payload and we access the name property, we assign it to the new name for the account state, and we're doing the same thing for email too. So let's go back here. If I do this one more time, so CLA2, and I'm not going to provide any email here. I'm going to update this. As you can see, the email is going to be now empty. So this is the payload we are passing here. We're passing simple name, and the second value for the object is going to be empty. If we go back to the state that we have now, we're going to have an empty email because whatever you're passing here is going to be the same. But here's the thing. Let me go back to the console. Let me refresh the page and take a look. When we type anything here, you're going to see the edit components getting re-rendered. Why? Because we're using a functional component, we're using a functional state to keep track of whatever the user is typing inside the input. So let's say we're going to keep the same name, CLA, and we're going to change the email. So we use email@gmail.com this time. So this is going to be the same name, right? And if I hit update, you can see that nothing changed. Nothing was re-rendered again, even though we're dispatching this action. Let's take a look. We dispatched this action, and because we're using the same name, Redux Toolkit will check whether this new value is the same as we have in the global state. If it's the same, Redux Toolkit will not re-render all the other components. So this is the best thing about using global state management. Even though we're calling the action to update that piece of data, Redux Toolkit will check whether that piece of data is the same. If it's the same, we don't really have to re-render the navbar, and we don't really have to re-render the sidebar here. Even though we're updating the email, as you can see, let's say this is the new state we have. It's the same name, but a different email. If you take a look at the diff, only the email was changed, name was not changed. So that's the good thing about using global state. All the other components, all the other subscribed components. What I mean by subscribed is that when you use a useSelector hook, like in the edit here, when you use the useSelector hook, the whole component is going to get subscribed to this state or to this value you're getting here. If the value is changing, all the whole component is going to get re-rendered. If the value is not going to change, that component is not going to get re-rendered again. This is how smart Redux Toolkit is. Let's take a look at navbar now. Navbar is subscribed to the store name. You can see it here. Now, the store name was not changed, so navbar didn't have to get re-rendered. But if we change this here, let's go with CLA2 and keep the same email. I'm going back to the console and check the latest console logs here. I'm going to update this, and as you can see, we have navbar re-rendered and we have the edit components re-rendered. If we add a console log for the menu link, we will see menu link re-rendered too. So behind the scene, Redux Toolkit is receiving that action. Redux Toolkit is aware that you want to change something, but since you're passing the same value, Redux Toolkit will not update that value. If the value gets updated, all the components subscribed to that value will get re-rendered, which is not really ideal. Okay, so now that we know how we can use Redux Toolkit to create a new store, to create some state slices like the account slice that we have, we also use the useSelector to select any piece of data from that global state, and we use the useDispatch to dispatch some actions to manipulate some piece of data from that global state. Now, the next thing we want to see is how we can use asynchronous operations and manipulate our state at the same time. So, in other words, can we have an action which executes some asynchronous operations, like calling another API, posting something to another API, or even updating some piece of values from an input? Now, we will use axios to do that. So this template starter file folder already contains axios as a dependency, so you don't need to install it really if you're using the same GitHub repository that we have provided. Otherwise, you need to install axios as a dependency for that. And the other thing we will need here is json-server. So json-server will allow you to create a full fake REST API. And we don't need to really code anything. Basically, you just need to install this dependency using either npm or yarn. And then you create a db.json file with any data to work as your fake API, okay, so, or your fake database. And then you need to start the JSON server, and this will watch the JSON file, and basically it will watch for any calls to any request to the endpoint this will provide you, and you'll be able to update this db.json file using JavaScript and asynchronous code too. So without any further ado, let's go back to our code, and as you can see, I've already created a db.json file. Now, this is my fictional database. This is a fake database, and JSON server is going to create a fake API for me to manipulate this database. So we have a profile object here, and it contains some fields like the name and email. So instead of, let's go back to the account slice. We will use some initial state here, but other than the initial state, what we want to do is we want to allow the user to update the name, but this time the user is going to update in real time the name, email, and store the new values in a real database, okay? And we will do all of this using axios. So there's going to be asynchronous operations, and we will manipulate our state using that. So two things you need, guys, to keep in mind here. Now, the first thing is an asynchronous operation or an asynchronous function or action that we're going to dispatch is basically the same. We can create it the same way as we create other actions. But the other thing here is that since this is an asynchronous operation, we can listen for all the status. We can listen for the pending status, we can listen for the rejected status, and we can also listen for the fulfilled status. And not only that, but we can also execute some kind of code for each status. So for example, we want to call an API. We want to use the patch method, for example, to update these two fields we see here, to update both the name and email. But once this gets fulfilled, once our request was accepted and we get a 201 response, or basically just 200 response because this is just a patch operation, we want to grab these new values and update our global state locally too. So we don't want to only update the database, but also our ReactJS application global state. So let's see how we can do this, guys. Now, we talked about asynchronous thunks in Redux. So basically, this new action is going to be an async thunk. Now, you can see already I'm importing createAsyncThunk method here from Redux Toolkit, and this is the one responsible for doing that. So when you create asynchronous thunks, you cannot create them, since they are basically just actions, you cannot create them just like the other actions, just like the update action, for example. You can't just do it right here, okay? Instead, we will need to create it separately outside of the create slice and export it too. So the way to do this is pretty straightforward. First, we're going to create a simple function here. It's going to be called update, let's go with account. So we will use the createAsyncThunk method here, okay? So whatever value this will return is going to be stored here. So we need to pass two things to the createAsyncThunk. The first thing is an identifier of somehow of the type of action. So it's going to be a simple string. The idea here is that whatever name you pass here is going to be the name of the action when you check it out in the developer tools extension, for example. So here, let's go with account slash update data. So whenever this action gets dispatched, this is the name we will get, okay? And the second thing is basically a simple callback function. Now this callback function is going to be a synchronous function. So I'm going to add a sync keyword here. So we're going to do a simple axios request, just like this. We're going to get a response from axios, which we're going to store in the response variable. So await axios.patch in our example, because we want to update whatever value we have in database.json here. It's like a real API. Now, the first thing we need to provide here is the API endpoint. And if I go back to the terminal, let's take a look. I haven't started watching or listening for the database. Now, to do that, all you need to type is json-server -- watch and then the name of the file you created. Now, keep this in mind, guys. I created the db.json file in my root folder. So the root of the project right here, it's not inside source. If it's inside source, then you need to specifically type src and then like this, db.json. So let's start watching for this file, and you will get directly a simple endpoint to call this single route. So we have a single route in the database.json. So let me paste this as the route we're going to call. And the second thing is simply an object, and this object is going to be the values or the action payload for this action. So we have a simple object with name and email, right? So we're going to get this as arguments here again. Let's go with name and email. Awesome. So that's it. Basically, we are creating the update account asynchronous action. So when you dispatch this action, you're going to call an API with a batch method, and you're going to pass an action payload. The server is going to store that in the database. And next, we will see how we can use the fulfilled status to update our global state locally. So all I need to do is to export this now, because I'm going to use it outside of this file. Now, the next thing I want to show you guys is this. Whenever you execute an asynchronous operation, it's just like promises. They have some statuses. Like first, the default status would be pending. When the promise is rejected, we get rejected status. And when the promise is resolved, we get the fulfilled status. So we can actually execute code based on each status for our asynchronous function we have here. The way to do that is by creating something, by passing another property, just like reducers. This property is called extraReducers, okay? Now, we pass it just like a function here, and we need to pass a builder argument. Why? Because this builder argument is going to be used to add cases for each status, just like this. So we use the builder argument, we access the add cases. So to execute a piece of code when the promise is fulfilled, and the promise I'm talking about now is the update account because it's an asynchronous function. Basically, we just need to type the name of that function. So update account dot fulfilled. This is the status we're looking for. This is the status we're trying to execute a function when we receive it. So yeah, the first argument is the status we want, and the second argument is what function you want to execute when it's fulfilled. So I'm going to pass this our function here. Basically, what I want to do is to pass also the state, current state, and the action to use the payload of the action. So the callback function we're passing here is simply the same as the reducer action we created. So we're passing again state and action, and we're going to manipulate something inside the state inside the function. So in our example, we want to do state.name equals action.payload.name, and it's going to be the same thing for email. Okay, so now we have our code ready, and we can test it out before we do a quick recap. So we created the asynchronous-thunk, which is basically just an asynchronous action we can dispatch, and we created some extra reducers to execute code when a status is given, like the fulfilled, for example. Awesome. So now let's just call this, let's dispatch this instead of the update. So I'm going to comment this first dispatch. Okay, and then instead of update action, I'm going to call the update data action. So let's see if we already have this one. Okay, it's update account, so update account. Cool. Let's make sure we have the same name, update account, cool. Awesome. So we're passing update account with an object containing both the name and email. Let's make sure this is the same thing here. Here we're not passing an object, we're not accepting an object, but we're accepting two separate arguments. So let's paste the object here. We're going to pass an object with two properties, and this is going to use the two properties to update this from the response. Okay, and one last thing, guys, we need to return response.data. Don't forget this. Otherwise, you will not see this in your developers tools extension. Okay, so let's see this in action now. I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to type CLA2 as a name and email 2 as the email. Now, before I do anything, let me show you. The database contains these values now, CLA and email at example. So in order for us to check whether the asynchronous operation works correctly or not, we should be able to see new values here in our database. So let's take a look. I'm going to update, click on the update right now. As you can see, a lot of things happen here. First thing is that we have the new name updated here, okay, and all the components that are using it. So this means that we're updating the global state correctly. Now let's check whether we're updating our database correctly too. Let's go back here, and as you can see, guys, we're updating both the name and email in our database, which means our asynchronous operation was successfully executed. And we have two actions called here. The first one is pending. So when you call an asynchronous action, the default status will be pending. As you can see, guys, you can see the action. Let's take a look. You can see the action of this fulfilled synchronous operation, and the action is this one. So it contains, this is the whole action, right? It has a type, it has a lot of other stuff, but the payload is what interests us the most. The payload is the values we're passing in the inputs. If you take a look at the state, we have a new state according to new values too. And yeah, basically we successfully updated both values, and we did that by calling an API. So we're doing asynchronous coding, and we're manipulating the piece of data that we have in our global state, and everything is done in the counter account slice, as you can see. So as a quick recap, we created the asyncthunk here. And asyncthunk accepts two things as arguments. The first thing is the name or identifier of this action, and the second argument is basically a callback function where you're going to do your asynchronous code. Our asynchronous code was simply calling our fake API. This is the URL, this is the endpoint, HTTP localhost/profile, and this is the value we're passing as action payload, right? So this is the value we're passing to our API, so our API can update the database. And yeah, and basically we're just returning whatever response data we got. And the next thing is the extraReducers. Now, this is the part responsible for updating the initial value we have here, right? So if we get rid of this part here, when you call the async code, when you call the asyncthunk here, you will see your database getting updated, but your application will not get updated. Let's take a look. I'm commenting out all the extraReducers here. We go back to our application. So I'm going to first show you the database. It's CLA2, email 2. Let's go back to CLA and email. I'm going to update this. You can see both actions were called, the pending and the fulfilled. If it was rejected, we would see rejected here, right? It was not rejected. So if we go back to the database, okay, everything was updated successfully, but inside our ReactJS components or our ReactJS application, nothing is actually getting updated. The components are not getting re-rendered. Take a look. If we go to console, we're not seeing any other components getting re-rendered, right? So if I go back to CLA3 update, we still see CLA, but we see CLA3 in our database, and you can see the action getting called again right here. Awesome. Okay, so this was it for today's tutorial. If you're interested in learning more, I would highly recommend you guys to check codelabsacademy.com. Now, Codelabs Academy is a online bootcamp provider. We provide a lot of bootcamps for many different programs, like, for example, cybersecurity, data science, UX, UI design, and web development too. The price is really affordable, and we have some campuses on the boil coming up. And you can also see any upcoming workshop that you can register to for free, and also watch all the previous workshops from the website. If you're looking for more information, please fill out this form in the contact us part, or you can just go directly and apply using all your information, so you can hear back from one of our teachers or one of the management, or from management with all the necessary information that you might require. So thanks a lot for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope it was informative for you. Let me know if you have any question, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.